I thought today, Jason, we could show you Ralph Wiggum, a Claude Code plugin. Have you heard about this before? It seems to have gotten quite popular over the holidays.
Ralph Wiggum has taken over my timeline, pretty much across the board, with TikTok and YouTube. Everybody's talking about it this week. So, yeah, I'm glad you've had some time to play with it and explain what it is.
All right, so from henceforth, I'll try to say Ralph Loop because I feel like the name change was pretty intentional after that. But it definitely did start off as Ralph Wiggum. Now, I will say over the holidays, I wasn't really playing around with my computer too much. So when I came back, I figured, let's go through GitHub, sort by what's popular, and I ended up on this awesome Claude repository. And funnily enough, right here on the top, there's a Ralph Wiggum button, and that's essentially what I clicked. So I clicked on here just to figure out what was going on because I'd never heard of it before. And then I kind of went through it, and it said it's like an AI loop technique. And I thought, well, I know loops. I'm very familiar with Bash loops. What's it actually doing? So my understanding is that it will continue to do something that might be not necessarily correct, but over multiple iterations in order to get closer to the result. Now, this isn't something that you need a plugin for. In fact, there is a plugin for Claude Code, but you could do this in Bash if you want. And I'll talk about an example in a moment. But essentially, this is a good way for you to go through many iterations of something. So let's say, in my case, I'll probably do about 10 to 20 iterations. You can also add other MCP servers to it if you'd like, which is pretty handy, as well as giving it what the criteria is for done. So maybe very similar to Amazon's editor. I think it's Kiro would allow you to set like a spec, for example, and then assign an agent to the spec and make sure that when it's done, it looks similar to the spec that you started out with. Imagine that type of workflow, but faster. So it's a faster dev loop. So you're working on maybe like one line of code or maybe one feature as opposed to an entire project. Not to say that you can't ship an entire project overnight. I think I set it loose on 3,000 tests to work on, and it did, in fact, work on them overnight and got most of them working. So what we're going to talk about is the Claude Code repo itself. Now, just a quick pointer here because I thought this was weird, but the Anthropic repo is actually Anthropics because the username already worked before, was already there before. So if we scroll down here in these plugins, there's quite a few of them, and I'll talk about how to install them. But essentially, so there's quite a few of them in here. The ones that I had heard about before, and you might have as well, are Code Review, for example, and then there's a front end one as well. So front end design. I think these are sort of the most popular plugins from last year, we'll say, because it feels like a new year is started and it's the year of Ralph. So if we scroll down to the bottom here, we've got Ralph Wiggum. And if we click into it, it talks a little bit about how Ralph works or how the Ralph plugin works. But essentially, it's a while true. So it'll run once and run a Ralph loop and say your task description. So we could say like, hey, create a multiplayer front end app or something like that. And then your completion promise, or what you're going to say is when you stop, essentially, you're going to look for done. Now, there's very simplistic here on this side. I would say there's one thing missing, which is called max iterations, which I actually found was pretty important. So right here, max iterations. So if I didn't set this, it should run infinitely. I don't think it actually does. It seems to hit the stop requirement very quickly. But if you set this to something like you start with 5 is probably a good example, it will in fact iterate through. So again, we're doing Ralph loop, then a prompt, then the iterations, then our promise. So if we go into a bash window here, one moment. Oh, sorry, if we go into looking at a bash loop here for a moment. So again, this is while true, and we could just write in true here if we want and do some coding and done. And I think if you wanted to do this on your own, it might be something like while true. Oh, I can't type, sorry. This is always the worst when you're on a stream and trying to do something. And I'm just using Datadog notebooks just in illustration purposes. You can do whatever you want, but it would be something like cat, a prompt, and then we'll send that off to Claude to do some work. And then we'll say, oops, my apologies, done right here. So essentially, while this is true, which is going to be forever, take the contents of our prompt, pipe it into Claude, and do done. So this is pretty common. I think some people were doing this before on your end and maybe on my end. I think I found quite a few devs that would like hit just up and enter, up, enter, up, enter. So just repeat the last prompt that they've done. For me, that might be something like continue with sequential thinking and maybe assign agents with it and like a non-deterministic number of agents. And that would work. And then if we look at this in Bash just for fun, so if we run this loop, we'll just do like an echo Ralph. I'll just continue, right? So it's quite a bit. And if you want to do something a little bit better, you could do sleep 5 and then echo. Oh, it's going to do something different anyway. If we go through and actually look at Claude itself. The way to get started with this, if you didn't want to go to the bash route, would be just to type in plugin, assuming that you've got an updated Claude. And I'm just going to hit enter here. Now it's very buried here. I think it's way at the bottom. Yeah, in fact, it is. So there's a Ralph Loop plugin in here that you can install. There's actually quite a few more, and you'll see that I've got the Swift LSP installed, for example, because I was working with Swift Code. You can do this for all users on the repository, only for you. And you can only do in this repo as well if you wanted to. So only for this, like this repo. So I'm just going to say for my user, and it will install it. And it's installed it. It said restart Claude to load new plugin. So I'm going to do that. Just hitting Control C twice. And start Claude again. And then again, we're just going to go into plugins to verify that it's installed. Not required, but if we go in here and we click installed, you'll see that I've got the Swift LSP that I talked about before, and then the Ralph U. So for Ralph, what we do to start a loop. So remember, we're not going to use Wiggum anymore because we kind of rebranded. So we're going to use Ralph Loop. And then you can see that it was rebranded because it's Ralph Loop, which seems a little bit redundant, but we're going to click that. Oh, my apologies. Ralph Loop. And then remember that we've got some requirements in here for how the loop works. So if we did something like, let's see here, fix the repo, and then we can do max iterations. We'll just say 5. And then let's see here. I think it's called completion promise. And we can just say done. Now, I happen to know this repo is a mess, so this could run forever, which is why we're at max iterations 5. But basically, over the holidays, I kind of let this repo slopify or maybe fester a little bit. Anyway, it got really big, like 64 gigabytes big. So it was massive. It had a bunch of binaries in there, just terrible stuff. Because I was playing with agents and things like that before Christmas. And when I came back, I thought, hey, we should clean the repo. So I ran this for a while. And it worked. Now, this is something that I think most devs would say, just to start fresh, wipe all the files, wipe all the tests. We're just going to start fresh with what we know and start. But it actually does work pretty well. So let's go through and click this, and you'll see kind of how it works. Now, I will note that scrolling sometimes can be an issue when it's running. So I can't really scroll up too quickly. But what it's going to do is just go through these. Now, I didn't turn on dangerously accept all permissions. For example, I did want to quickly go through them. There's also an article written by the author of Claude Code recently where they said that putting these in exceptions in the Claude directory within the repo is probably a better practice than just YOLO accepting everything, which I think is probably good. And I believe you and I were also talking about, hey, containerizing these or sandboxing them is probably better. So I'm trying to be a little bit more responsible in the new year. All right, so I'm going to say yes, but for all the other commands going forward. And it's going to continue through. Now, this loop could go for a while, especially if you've just said accept all permissions. But one thing I do want to say is just because it stopped and said it's done doesn't mean that you shouldn't restart it again. In fact, don't feel bad about restarting some of the loops. And I've run some of these for I want to say like 7 to 8 hours for some of the runs, but it works really well. And I think what a lot of people would say is that even though you can use this with something like Haiku, or you could use it with Sonnet, most people will say to go to Opus. It seems to give you better results for this, mostly because you don't have to go back and fiddle with things, especially because you're going to be running this as a long-lived task. So it's not something that you're going to run and then immediately look at. So the speed of the model doesn't matter so much, but the correctness does, because the next time the loop starts, it's going to be fixing what was maybe left over from the last iteration. So it's better to just get it done as fast as possible. I will also say if you switch to default, I did notice it going down to Haiku once in a while. So it's probably worth either using Opus if you want, or Sonnet for a little bit more context. I found that Sonnet gave me good results, but it felt like for longer tasks that Opus was the best. So I think that kind of covers it. So it's essentially a bash loop. You could write your own. There is a plugin that you can use. And I believe this could apply to things more than just Claude Code. I think the person who originally coined the term was talking about AMP at the time, which is from SourceGraph. So there are multiple ways that you could do this. But I think what's really stuck is using Claude Code with Opus for these kind of not impossible tasks, but those ones that you've had for a while that you thought were going to be very difficult to deal with, but you'd actually need to sink some development time or some engineering time into in order to fix it. This seems to be that unblocker for a lot of people.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I feel like, yeah, like you just said, a lot of the projects, there just comes a time where you really wish you had more hours in the day or a little helper that could just take care of some stuff while you sleep, some little things, iterate on it. And this sounds like that's a step in that direction. And but really nothing new in terms of loops and how we think about that kind of thing. So very handy, but also potentially maybe dangerous too, or at least
Yes.
uh, you know,
So I guess I should make a strong, maybe more stronger recommendation is that yes, if you're running something where you're accepting all the permissions and you're running it in a loop, I really do feel like you should at least containerize it, use a cloud shell. I think Jason, you had mentioned that the other day, something that would allow you to isolate this from your laptop, your business computer, your workstation, things where there are files. We've seen before that in general, models are really good at being responsible, but it's better to have a safety net just in case.
yeah. Well, and it has that escape word that it uses to sort of escape out of the loop. I feel like that's, great. Got to have something. But I also wonder, what if, is there some way for that to be mistakenly made, in the process, and we really weren't ready for it to escape out of the loop, But then again, I haven't had my hands on it, so I'll have to go spend some time and see what it comes up with.
I'd love to hear what you think because it feels like this type of approach is going to be something that we'll be using for the next little bit, at least in terms of working on something and refining. And it feels like this workflow may have a different name soon, but at least this iterative process seems to be quite handy.
Hmm. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate you showing all set. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jason.
Bye.